Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sagicor Intimate Chats. I'm Carolyn Shepherd, and today we're going to be talking hurricane preparedness. With all the uncertainty we've had over the last few months, we want to be prepared for any risks that we may be exposed to for this active hurricane season. So before we get into the topic, I'd like to introduce my fascinating guests. So joining us from Sagicor General, we have three gentlemen today. And the first is Mr. Mark Prescott, who's the Vice President of Operations for Sagicor General Inc. I said Sagicor General. And then we have Mr. Keith Herbert, who is the Manager for the Eastern Caribbean Operations for Sagicor General. And Mr. Richard Smith, our very own marketing team member for Sagicor General, who's also very passionate about hurricane preparedness and preparedness in general. And being so gracious as to join us from the outside are Miss Elizabeth Riley, who is the Acting Executive Director for SEDEMA. There's Carolyn Reed, who is a radio host and influencer and philanthropist. And as well, we have Mr. John Hazard, who is a premier Caribbean chef who's joining us today from St. Kitts. Welcome, everyone. So when we talk about hurricane preparedness, a lot of the time we feel like, we hear this every year, we've heard it all before, but yet when a hurricane actually strikes, so many people are not prepared. Elizabeth, can you talk to us a little bit about why that is and what your experience has been with SEDEMA on that topic?
Absolutely, Carolyn. And first, thanks so much for inviting SEDEMA to be a part of today's conversation. We're really happy to partner with Sagicor on this. Well, first, the hurricane season for 2020 is expected to be a well above average one.
Wow.
In fact, the Colorado State University is anticipating 19 named storms, 9 of which will become hurricanes, and 4 of which would be major hurricanes, which are a category 3, 4, or 5. Mm-hmm. And this year is a very interesting year for us, and also I think a year that will be in some ways challenging because the hurricane hazard is being faced along with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So when we're discussing the issue of preparedness, when we take into consideration the health protocols that have to be applied during this hurricane season, we need to start even earlier in the preparation. And so why do people not prepare? I think that we have a mixed situation in the region with respect to populations and how persons perceive that risk and the risk that is posed by hurricanes. And in territories where we have had previous hurricane experiences, we do find that populations tend to be much more aware and sensitized and will take early actions. In territories which have not been that recently impacted, and we have seen this over the years, there may be a bit of complacency. But the important thing that we always say to our populations is that it takes only one storm. So notwithstanding the forecast for the season, it is important to take their preparedness actions very early.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So when we talk about the hurricane season, we think a lot about prioritizing, protecting the things that matter most. And for most of us, that will be family and, of course, our investments, our homes, and the contents that we've invested in. And we have a little video here where we're going to take a little pause and talk about how do we prepare to protect our home in advance of a hurricane.
Well, roofing is important for residential and commercial purposes in terms of protection of the structure itself. In the incidence of hurricane preparedness, you're going to have a massive amount of water, and you would want to protect those roofing systems from the water coming into your internal spaces. So you have your metal roofs, you have your tile roofs, you have your shingles, etc. Also, you have your flat concrete roofs. So depending on the membranes that you've installed on these various structures, you may want to have a review of them at this point in time before the hurricane season does come in. If you have your flat roofs, you may want to re-examine the waterproofing that you've used. or you may want to do some new waterproofing system on top of what is there existing. Your metal roofs have bolts, so those bolt heads have rubber seals around them. So what you may want to consider is that depending on the age of the roof, you may want to look at the seals around the bolt heads. Now, there are things that you can use to cap the bolt heads. In my profession, what we do is that we don't necessarily use typical hardware store systems, but we have specialized things that we use to try to protect the bolt heads from further degradation by the sun. So in terms of your roofing, you want to protect your roof, you want to make sure your waterproofing is sound. If your waterproofing is not sound, you need to get a professional to come in and to do some work for you. That is something that you should consider strongly.
So Mark, a roof is probably one of the most expensive parts of your home. And when a roof is destroyed, it means that there's quite an expensive rebuild. Tell us a little bit about how to make sure that you have the financial wherewithal to be able to actually do that rebuild.
Once you have the home and the roof is being damaged, one should look at your insurance policy to see whether or not you have coverage for hurricanes and those allied perils. If you have a homeowner's policy, this homeowner's policy would not normally cover hurricanes, storms, earthquake, and those other risks. Similarly, for businesses, you can cover those perils under a business policy, as well as covering your loss of business as a result of the storm.
Thanks, Mark. Keith, I want to ask you some questions because, as Elizabeth said earlier, I mean, here in Barbados, we have been blessed, we have been lucky, but we have no guarantees. In the EC over the last few years, there have been a number of perils. And tell us a little bit about your experience and what our customers there would have experienced.
Thanks, Carolyn. You're right. In the Eastern Caribbean, or I should say the more northerly Caribbean islands, we tend to feel the brunt and experience the full wrath of these hurricanes more than territories, the islands that are in the south. So we are somewhat of, you could consider us somewhat as experts in dealing with hurricanes. And different territories will tend to have pretty much the same experience once a hurricane is threatening to come through. It's important that you have a plan well in advance of the start of the hurricane season. And for some, hurricane plans could simply mean just putting that list together of the things that you need, your supplies that are necessary, any work that is necessary on your house, making sure your insurance coverage is in place, and giving yourself enough time so that if you need to budget to address some of these items on your list, that you have time that as you get into the hurricane season, these things are already in place. We have seen storms at different range. We have seen the tropical storms. We have seen categories up to category 5 hurricanes come through in our territories. We've seen vast levels of destruction. And what I can say, had it not been for, in many cases, the insurance coverages that are in place, many of these properties would not have rebuilt after hurricanes. The extent of the damage could be water damage, some in many cases, their total destruction of buildings. And we've seen it throughout the years in different forms and fashion. And many people, after storms, maybe after they would have rebuilt, on renewing their policies, they will express gratitude to us as insurers for having been able to allow them to rebuild following these storms. So It's important that you have that plan in place, and that plan should also include making sure your insurance coverage is up to date and paid. That we that we will be quite happy to settle your claim as quickly as possible.
Now, a lot of us here in this conversation, I'm sure about at least 5 of us for sure, have children. Elizabeth, can you talk to us a little bit? I know Cece does, I do, Richard, Mark. Can you talk to us a little bit about protecting, really what's the most important? Because we can insure our homes, and we definitely need to insure our homes because that's part of protecting our loved ones, because they need a shelter, a safe place, etc. But how do we protect our families? How do we prepare to protect our families during these times?
Well, I think the most important thing is about having a family plan. And we encourage at Sindima individuals to discuss with their families what are going to be your arrangements in the event of an emergency. Mm-hmm. And that involves, for example, where are we going to shelter? Where is that safe space going to be? Is it going to be at home? Do we have a safe room at home that has been identified?
What is a safe room, Elizabeth?
A safe room, very good question. So one of the principal recommendations that we make is to look first at sheltering within your own home. And this alleviates the pressure on the national system to be able to accommodate large numbers in shelters. And of course, this year, in a COVID environment, there are going to be challenges with the national shelters because Absolutely. In some cases we do have reduced capacity. This has already happened. So the safe room is really about making an investment within your existing structure where you put additional reinforcement. So we have situations, for example, at my home, we have shutters. This is the roller shutters in a particular room, which has a bathroom access. And it would allow us to secure ourselves in a very specific space within the home so that even if other areas of the home become breached, that area should be safe. So this is what the safe room concept is all about.
Okay. Now, I just, in terms of the Dominica experience from a few years ago, I heard a very disturbing story, and I think it's one of the ones that's affected me most in terms of making me understand how crazy a hurricane can be. And one of my friends, they actually had to lock themselves and one of their children in a closet and hold the door closed for 2 hours because everything else in the room basically left through the windows and doors. So the importance of a safe room, if you had a safe room, that would have protected that area, kept the room from the wind, from the high wind, that would not have been a situation. And of course, the trauma that comes from a child knowing that the only difference between, well-being and certain danger is holding this door closed for hours and knowing you can't let go no matter what until the wind dies down. So, I didn't know about the safe room, but I absolutely feel that that's something that anybody who has the capacity to do so should certainly look into. Cece, you have a small child. What are you looking at doing in terms of hurricane preparedness this year?
Well, the good thing is, good morning, to be here. I'm glad that we're having this conversation. One of my biggest things is they're doing it in school. So he has had some conversations in school about natural disasters. So he's learning about it. He's only 5. But my biggest thing is, how do you prepare a child so small without scaring them? So maybe it's more of a question. I'm starting, we have our plan, we have the documents in our waterproof holder, all that stuff. But then how do you have that conversation with a child who's so young without scaring them? You want them to be aware, but my concern is really kind of putting that fear into them at this age. So I don't know if someone can help me kind of guide and navigate that conversation.
Well, I think that's a great conversation, and I think Richard would be the best poised person to answer that, because Richard actually does family drills with his 3 children and has done so for a number of years. So I think preparedness and practice means that there's less trepidation when something might occur. Richard?
That's actually spot on. For me, what we do is we start with involving the kids, sort of like a council meeting. So they're involved from the early stages of preparing. Includes the external preparation of the house and surroundings, as well as the internal preparation in terms of packing their go bags, identifying what items we would need to put into our storage bin, if we had to evacuate to emergency shelter, what canned foods and so on would be required. But then the second phase for me is after we've agreed on the plan and we've documented the plan and we've posted it on our refrigerator so everyone is constantly reminded of it. What we do then is we exercise the plan. So it's through kind of role play at first, so that you play out the scenario. Okay, kids, imagine a hurricane is coming. What do you do now? And then when they're more comfortable with that, then the final phase for me would be to actually do an emergency drill where you have the whistle, you identify that the whistle means that we're going to be in full hurricane prep mode, and try to exercise the entire plan to the point where you literally pack the car and drive out of your driveway. And for me, once those steps are done, the kids are less traumatized. They've gone through the process, they know what to expect, and then they are more helpful to themselves and to you as a family.
John, you've traveled around the Caribbean. Tell us about how you see various levels of preparation and how you prepare and protect your family while you're away.
Yeah, well, one of the things I do, as I'm not in Barbados at this point in time, is I'm having my wife just check on our house insurance and making sure that our house insurance is all up to date. That was a question we're actually going to have for Mark as well, too. If your house is valued at a certain amount, how much more should you insure your house in terms of replaceable value of the house? The other thing as well, too, which I do is just make sure that we have plenty of canned stuff in the house. Generally, we will make like breads and muffins and different cakes we can have to snack on. The other thing as well, I have her preparing as well, is making sure we have a lot of bottled water as well in the house, and just getting a lot of this food stuff prepared just in the event of an hurricane. But one of the questions I really wanted to ask Mark is in terms of how much would you, or how much should you insure the house for, or what, let's say your house is valued at $500,000. Of course, how much do you insure for that? Is that amount, or do you go a bit more than that? That's my kind of question I wanted to ask you.
In terms of the value of insurance, we normally require the rebuilding costs rather than the value of the house, because the value of the house sale price is a different cost. Yes, and it's different cost than rebuilding. Mm-hmm. So we look at rebuilding costs, and it is advisable ever so often to have a proper valuation done in terms of rebuilding costs to see that it is up to date, right, and at the current market costs.
Because the current cost for rebuilding might well be higher than the cost than the value.
The sale value of the house,
depending on the real estate market at any given time.
Yes.
That's an interesting consideration. But there's also the danger of underinsurance. Can you tell us about that a little bit as well?
Underinsurance in layman's terms is what we in insurance insurance circles call average.
Right.
So when you hear average, it is underinsurance.
Right.
And underinsurance is very simple. It's a very simple concept. It's that if you have not got your property insured to its true rebuilding costs, then and your sum insured is inadequate, you will just be paid a portion of the claim.
Right.
For instance, if you have a property insured for $10 and the value for rebuilding is $20 and you have a claim of $5,
right,
then you're only going to be paid $2.50. In essence, it's just a percentage. You're only going to be paid a percentage of the claim.
And that percentage matches up with what?
The percentage matches up to the the rebuilding costs.
Right. So the percentage that you've insured of the property is the percentage that you will be paid in a claim.
In a claim.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Of the rebuilding costs.
Of the rebuilding costs, and not
Yes.
necessarily the valuation. So what is the difference between the valuation and the rebuilding costs? Why is there a difference there?
Okay. Most valuations look at the sale of a property.
Right.
Insurance is concerned with the rebuilding costs of the property.
Right.
So you may have a property that the value may be $100, whereas the rebuilding costs may be $200.
Right. Or vice versa.
Yes.
Right.
So insurance is based on the rebuilding costs because we're rebuilding a property rather
Right.
than replacing a property.
Because it's irreplaceable, to be
Correct.
honest.
So you look at the rebuilding costs to look at the claim,
Right.
and you look at your sum insured, and you look at the sum insured in relation to the rebuilding costs.
Right.
If your sum insured is lower than the rebuilding costs, then you're said to be underinsured,
And then that's where the
and that is
percentages
where the
kick in.
percentages kick in. So the percentage of the sum insured as it relates to the rebuilding costs.
Okay.
And then the claim will be
Right.
proportionately reduced when you consider those two.
If I may just assist.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Keith.
Add to what Marcus said. So what the condition of average says is that we will only pay in relation to what you have insured compared to the true cost of the insurance of the
So the
property.
percentage of the true cost,
Yes.
it's a proportion that we will pay.
It is right. So if you're insuring 50% of your house, so your true value is $20. You insured $10. So you've only insured half
50% of your house.
right. So
Technically.
if you have a claim, whatever your claim amount is, you will pay that same proportion, which is 50% of your claim.
Okay. So,
Let's use bigger figures.
So
Let's use
before
bigger
we-
figures.
sorry, Keith, before we use bigger figures, I think one of the things to highlight here, therefore, is that we feel that as laymen, that in your example, that if we have a claim for $5 and we're insured for $10, then we'll be paid the full $5 because we are insured for 10. But in truth and in fact, it's a percentage of the value that you've insured that you'll be paid, and not the
full amount,
full
of your
amount
claim.
of your payment. So being underinsured means that you get paid out a lot less than you would typically expect if you
That
were
is
fully insured. Yes?
That is correct.
I'm trying to make sure I understand, because then we'll all understand.
Right, that is correct. And insurers want you to insure the replacement cost of the building, the full replacement cost. So if you decide to insure for less than the full value of your home, then consider that you're insuring or self-insuring that portion that you have not insured. So if you use bigger figures, let's just use 100,000, and you chose to insure, your house is valued, replacement cost is 100,000. You've chosen to insure for 50,000. We are going to consider that you're giving us 50,000 to insure, but you're going to insure that other 50,000 of the house. So if you then have a claim, we're going to share in that claim in the same proportion,
Yes,
right?
understood.
So, we don't want people to be of the impression that, listen, I have $50,000 worth of coverage. My claim is 10,000 within the 50,000. So I should be able to get my claim fully paid. But then if you look at it, that $10,000 claim that you have which portion of the property is damaged? Is it the share that we insure or right? So it's unfair to ask us to just bear the full claim when you didn't insure the full property.
That makes sense.
Right?
No.
So that is the rationale behind it.
So Mark, tell me about the different levels of cover, because there are people who are homeowners, there are people who are renters, and of course there are business owners. And what are the types of protection that are afforded by insurance to these different groups of people?
Carolyn, in terms of the covers afforded, let's start with the homeowner, who is the actual owner of the home. You can take out home insurance, which covers the building and for fire, hurricane, storms. And you can also, if you own the contents as a homeowner, then you can also insure those items
As part of the homeowner's policy.
Mm-hmm. Again, if you're a renter and you're only, you can insure your contents under the homeowner's policy, but for contents cover.
Right.
And the same level of cover for hurricanes, etc., will be afforded the contents cover.
Okay.
For business owners generally have fire and perils,
Mm-hmm.
So they insure fire, hurricane, earthquake, and those perils. And for their loss of profits, they can take out what is called business interruption insurance.
Okay.
So they can cover their loss of profits in the event that their property is damaged and they cannot carry on business in the way that they would normally have done,
Okay.
had it not been for a storm.
It's good to know. So then a hurricane has come through. How then do we claim, especially if the roads are impassable and, the insurance adjusters can't make it physically onto your property?
What we would suggest is that you take photographs of the damaged areas of your property, and if it is contents, the damaged contents, and save those pictures. If you have internet connection, you can then email those photographs to the insurance company, and
To get that process
started, as well as downloading a claim form and completing it and emailing it back into the insurance company.
Technology.
So if there's no internet service, then you can just take the photographs, and as long as there's time that once the roads are open again and you're able to make it to the insurance company, then you are able to process the claim there, and we will send adjusters out to have a look at the property.
Right.
and assess the damage.
I think it would be a good time now to, again, look at the property and some of the things that we can do to protect them and to reduce the amount of claims and, of course, the amount of damage, because the amount of damage means that that's the amount of displacement. The more damaged your home is, the more you are displaced as the homeowner. So let's talk about our basements and foundations and what we can do to prepare to protect those areas when a hurricane threatens.
The third tip is for basements and foundations, and we're talking about protecting them from mass water, hydrostatic pressure. So if you have a foundation wall, and this wall is now covered by soil, maybe a walkway, and the soil is being supersaturated by the rainfall, you would want to consider, and it's not accessible in order to stop the moisture from coming into the walls. Maybe the waterproofing that you would have done initially has failed, or it has lived out this usefulness, and maybe that water now is migrating on the inside of the wall, giving you a moldy smell and a damp feeling within your basement area. In that instance, what we would recommend is to actually work on the inside of the wall and try to waterproof it from that end, because trying to remove the soil on the outside and the pavement, etc., may be too costly. And the more economical solution would be to work from the inside. if that is possible.
So not everyone is a homeowner though. And I feel like there are a lot of people who rent properties and won't have the ability to, protect that property because it's really not their investment. And so I guess two of my questions, and maybe to you, Elizabeth, and whoever else is on the call might be able to answer. But in terms of renters, contents insurance, to what extent is that available? Are there any restrictions, limitations, etc.? But also, what can someone who doesn't own the property do to protect it without, huge investments in infrastructural repairs, etc.?
From the insurance point of view, there's contents insurance, and that can be obtained under the same homeowner's policy, and it covers the perils are the same that are covered for the home: fire, hurricane, earthquake, riot, strikes. All the full perils are covered, and therefore the contents can be covered in that way. In addition to that, the policy covers a lot more than just the perils.
Okay.
In the event that you are a renter, the policy would cover your public liability, and if you have a domestic employee, it will cover your liability to that domestic employee. And in the event of a hurricane where you're displaced, where the property is damaged, and you have to go elsewhere and rent, then it will cover you for that rental cost.
Okay, now that sounds like something that a lot of people ought to know about. And I do believe, I didn't know that was available for contents insurance, but it is available for homeowners insurance. So again, if you are displaced from your home and you have to seek alternative accommodations, which come with a price tag, Sagicor will cover some of the cost of that displacement.
Yes, the policy will cover that.
Okay.
I also mark a question as well too. What I also wanted to ask as well is, if you have the house insurance, if you're a homeowner, would you also have to have the contents insurance as well, or does that home ownership insurance cover everything? Because obviously the value of your house is different than the contents that you have inside your house if you're a homeowner. Would you need to have two insurances?
As a homeowner, you can have on the same policy, you cover the building and you also cover the contents as well.
Okay.
And the cover is the same for both sections.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to add to what Mark said, but more following on Carolyn's question regarding what does a renter do on the approach of a hurricane. And this is part of the planning that goes before the hurricane. If you're a renter, you should be able to have your plans, have a chat with your landlord to ensure that there's a plan when it comes to protecting the property, whether it includes shutters, whether it includes just re-looking at the building to ensure that the roof is properly secured, drains are clean. But this too falls in as part of your plans for the hurricane. And again, this should not be done when there's an announcement or that there's a warning that a hurricane is approaching. This should be done well in advance, maybe in May, as we get into June. Your plan should be prepared and you start to executing the preliminaries related to that plan. So it's the right time for you to have a chat with your landlord and ask, are these things in place or can these things be done? If there are no shutters on your property, can I get shutters installed? Or can you make some provisions to have the windows protected? And so this gets executed before a hurricane is announced or a notice is given for a hurricane. And so you can be a lot more comfortable in your home in addition to the insurance that you would have from Sagicor.
In addition to that, Carolyn, it would all depend too on what your rental agreement or lease agreement states,
Covers.
because in some lease agreements or rental agreements, you are responsible for the upkeep of the premises. So that too will play an important part in preparing the property if you have to, in relation to the impending storm.
Right,
May I speak a little bit on the matter of the sheltering?
right.
So if we do have a situation where the rental property is not secure, the consideration for the family, of course, would be about going to a shelter and a public shelter. And I wanted to mention this area because this year, of course, the management of shelters is taking into consideration the issue of COVID-19. And across the region, you will realize that national emergency management offices have been requesting persons to ensure that they are coming to the shelter not just with the usual food stocks, water requirements, and personal items, but also personal protective equipment. So there's a
Masks,
requirement for the
etc.
wearing of masks. In situations where it may be necessary, you may need to move with gloves as well. But it is very important for individuals to pay very close attention to the modified guidance being given for coming into shelters for 2020.
That's good information. But let's talk about shelters generally, because again, I think we think of shelters as some place that we go and the hurricane passes and then we go back home. But that's not necessarily the case, because sometimes people in the Bahamas, people were in shelters for several weeks because of the devastation. Can you talk to us about long-term stays in shelters and some of the things that you can take along to prepare for that long-term stay?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting situation, particularly in the aftermath of Dorian in the Bahamas and also with Irma and Maria. And one of the situations that we face in the region is that a number of our countries, for example, use schools as shelters. Now, this is not ideal because, of course, we were discussing the children earlier, and we do want to get children back to a situation of normalcy as soon as possible. So we don't encourage the use of schools as shelters, but we recognize that sometimes that is a requirement. With respect to persons coming into shelters, in situations where they're unable to return to their homes, governments have looked at options for transitional housing until they can be moved to more permanent settlement. What we can say with respect to what persons can bring into the shelter is to follow the guidance of the National Emergency Management Offices. So you do want to, for example, have clothing for a set period of time. Usually, emergency offices will indicate 4 to 5 days. In some cases, some countries have stipulations on how long you are allowed to stay in a shelter. So one of our territories, for example, indicates only a 3-day period. So it varies across the region. So you do have to look at that. And the amount of the food items, water, clothing, etc., are guided by what the National Emergency Management Office says.
So then in instances where, and I'm putting you on the spot here, and so you can let me know if it's not something that you can answer, but in instances where, for example, in Bahamas, where they were there for several weeks, when you have clothing for 4 to 5 days, there are no laundry facilities. In some instances, you've got food for 4 to 5 days, but the supermarkets are, damaged in the same manner as the homes have been damaged. How do people survive and cope with those situations?
In the extended situations of requiring shelter, well, this is where the government's social...
Clean clothing, extra food, etc.
Yeah, this is where the government's social welfare mechanisms kick in. And every country within the SEDEMA system has national level committees which address specifically matters of social welfare and matters related to relief.
Right.
So if there are requirements in the aftermath of events where families have been so severely affected that they may have lost their personal belongings, and this has happened in many instances, or they have also lost their livelihoods. So there's no means of income, but of course the family still has to survive. The government welfare mechanisms kick in, usually through their welfare or relief committees, where they make food available to persons who've been affected. Clothing is also made available. Psychosocial support is also delivered to these families. You can well imagine the level of disruption to individuals.
Loss and trauma.
Loss and trauma. And the psychosocial support is now becoming a much more important feature in the types of services provided by our governments in the aftermath of events.
And in terms of access to, essential services, so to speak, because all of our systems are put under tremendous pressure when these events occur. So whether you need to see a doctor, whether you need to get additional money from the bank, I do believe that there are some limitations in how much money they want you to take to a shelter in the first instance, but whether the bank is open to get additional access to funds might be another consideration. I mean, I think that we think a storm passes and then after it passes, it's business as usual, but often it is not.
No, absolutely it is not. And the most recent field experience I had was in the British Virgin Islands, in the immediate aftermath after Irma. And this is why the preparedness recommendations are so important. So when a National Emergency Management Office says to you, you should have cash in hand before the impact of a hurricane, this is not a recommendation to be taken lightly. When I went into the BVI, it was about 2 days after the impact, and the banks were non-existent. In fact, the structures themselves were completely destroyed. There was no bank. So to be able to access cash, you could not get it from the bank because the bank was not functioning. And this is why the preparedness actions, they're very important. When the recommendations come to fill your car with gasoline before the impact of a system, it is very important you do so. Because in the aftermath, often you are unable to get fuel, or the fuel that's available is going to be rationed
to the emergency
and prioritized for emergency services. So the notion of getting back to normal immediately after a significant impact, dispel that notion. It is very important. You need to listen to the preparedness recommendations and to follow them.
And I know I'm sticking with you a lot here, but you are the resident expert. But in terms of roads and access, because that's generally one of the major things as well, because, your home, you may not even be able to get back to your home to see what condition it's in because of fallen trees, debris, etc. And people sometimes don't take seriously the recommendations of when it is safe to be back on the road and when it's not.
Yeah, so the issue of access is a major one, of course, and this is why the preparedness recommendations ahead of a system talk about making sure you're self-sufficient for a minimum period of time.
Right.
And usually they will say 5 days, sometimes 7 days, that you're able to self-sustain. Because the reality is sometimes you just are unable to move. In Hurricane Maria, in Dominica, for example, communities were cut off for sometimes 2, maybe 3 weeks, which means that everything that you need has to be sourced from within. And this is where also community level arrangements are so important. So when we talk about the community emergency response teams, why do we train those? Because we want to make sure that if the first responders from the national level arrangements are not able to access your community immediately, that you have persons in community who have an understanding of the actions that need to be taken as well. And I think it also speaks very much to the whole aspect of community spirit And I think that this is one of our strengths in the Caribbean in terms of how persons rally around those who have been impacted and really seek to assist those as well. And I think this is something that's very important, and we need to support our district emergency organizations or community organizations, however they're termed, depending on your country. It's important to get involved, because in the aftermath of events, it is important that the community itself is able to support those within that space that are impacted.
And in terms of elderly persons who may be living on their own, I find increasingly in the Caribbean, and sadly, there are many elderly people who don't have families. What are your recommendations for those persons?
Yes, the community emergency arrangements through the district organizations is really critical.
Right.
One of the preparedness actions that's undertaken by these community organizations is actually the identification of the vulnerable persons.
Right.
And that's a very critical step, because if a major system is coming, and let us say you have 20 vulnerable persons in the community, you have to have a plan for those persons. It may be that the vulnerability is because of their age. It could be because they're differently abled. And all of these are areas that you need to look at. Persons who may suffer from mental health conditions. How do we...
And having a supply of the medication that you might need on hand for a number of weeks, and not expecting that the pharmacy will be open the next week necessarily.
Absolutely.
Right.
And for the vulnerable persons, there must be a plan as to how you're going to secure them. Right. So if there are 20 persons, is it that 10 of them can be accommodated with neighbors,
right,
for example? Or do you have to look at moving them into shelter? Is there going to be assistance required to move them to a shelter? Let's say, for example, if a person is wheelchair bound. So these are all parts of the preparedness actions that are required at the community and family levels.
Keith, I want to come over to you for a moment, again, because of your experience in the EC and having these systems come through the EC causing a lot of damage. And I want to talk about basic access to utilities, because my understanding is that in terms of communication, in terms of electricity, even water supplies can be restricted for a period of time. And to talk to me a little bit about how communities have coped in these circumstances and what learnings we can take from that experience.
Thanks, Karen. What I can say, the expected aftermath is different depending on the level of storm activity that the country would have experienced. Antigua would have, over the past several years, we would have had that process where a storm is named, we put on the storm or hurricane watch, then we go into a warning, and sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes we experience the wind, the rain. Sometimes we get a category 1, we get a category 2. In most instances where we're going past a category 1 or 2, we would experience a retraction of the utility services, particularly electricity. Once that grid goes down, and it's generally taken offline for our safety. Many times the hurricanes can go from a tropical storm to a Cat 2 as it passes over you. And so for our safety, they would take the electricity off grid. That way, as the storm goes through, it's a safer environment. And even if they're falling poles, if they're falling utility lines, it's safe for the emergency crews to move around and the likes. So after a storm, you can expect that the utility companies would have a process where they do their inspections and ensure that whatever repairs are done before they re-energize the grids. The re-energizing of the electricity could take as long as a few days. Sometimes it could be weeks, and in many instances, it's months before you would get back electricity. We've seen Dominica, even in a year after the storm in Dominica, there are some areas in Dominica that were still without electricity. They've done a remarkable job in rebuilding, and that is testament to how much of a community spirit there is. There is also assistance that's been given from neighboring territories in helping to restore those type of facilities. Now, that's electricity in itself, and then you have water, which is also very essential. Many times the water would be taken offline again for safety. And before that water is put back online, a series of tests needs to be carried out to ensure that there's no contamination with your water sources and the likes, because you cannot pump unsafe water back into the water grid. What we have seen though, and sticking to utilities, the quickest thing to get back to come back online most times is our cell phone service.
What we truly consider essential.
Because most times the cell phone service is wireless, and so most times once an antenna can be reinstalled, that normally comes back up in a few days. But yes, there are varying degree of wait time, and so it's important that you have some persons have backup generator facilities. Just ensure that you have fuel that could last you for at least a week. Ensure that you have make some provisions for canned foods so that you can have some sustainability. Ensure that you have clean potable water and stores that you can care for yourself, not only to drink but also to care for yourself, and that includes bathing, and these are even more so important when you have young kids, babies, and the elderly. So again, all of this comes back down to having a plan. Different things can happen over time. Shelters, being in a shelter, and it's so important, whatever your choice of actions are going to be, it's important that you have a plan and you know what that plan is. I'm happy to hear Richard saying that they actually run drills. I never thought of that. It's something that I will try to introduce at home, because that is very important, that you know what to do and you don't wait until you're in the situation to actually be doing it. So, I think it's all starts with a plan. Make sure you have a plan. Look at your plan. Everybody that's in your household should be aware of the plan and know their part in the plan.
Agreed. Now, we're going to talk about a go bag in a bit, and I'm going to ask Richard to talk about that. But before I do that, I'm going to put John on the spot for a little bit, because John is a premier chef and therefore an expert on food. So I'm going to ask John, outside of canned goods, what are some of the things that we can prepare to kind of keep us over that week-long initial period where we may be in a shelter, we may not have access to supermarkets, etc., but we do want to provide nutritious, filling food to our families even during that period of time.
Yeah, well, one of the things I will promote is, which I have at home as well too. You can always invest. I always tell people to invest in like what's called a butane gas stove. It's a small little stove with these butane gas canisters that when electricity or gas goes, you can still cook at home, because sometimes a lot of our stoves as well too are electrical or work off electricity as well. And if you have this little stove, which I have a few of them at home, I can put on a pot and I can boil some pasta, I can still cook, and we can still function until we get back our gas or electricity supply. So it's a small little stove called a butane gas stove you can purchase in Barbados. I know you can get them from Forgos. I've also seen them as well too in hardware stores as well too in Barbados. Nick Carter's has these butane gas stoves as well. But some of the things that I would suggest people can do is, for one, you can go ahead and make like some jams or jellies and have that stuff at home. You can also make some breads for yourself. Another good thing you can do is to make cookies that you can always snack on, during the hurricane. Or you can also make cake or muffins. Is another thing as well you can also make. The other thing as well is you can make your own granola, which I normally make at home, or you can also buy cereals. So you can have that stuff to also eat, if you have a hurricane. I already mentioned water as well too, but the other thing is I would normally suggest stocking up on fruits, bananas, oranges, stuff that doesn't have to go in the refrigerator, apples. You can get, I'm trying to think of other things, well, grapes, of course. But, if you can get as many fruits as you can to stock up on, I would suggest you do that as well. And also fresh vegetables. You can also eat vegetables raw. You can eat carrots raw, celery. You normally call it crudité and things that you can stock up on as well. So fresh vegetables and fresh fruits, I would suggest. Of course, you can get some chips. You can make your own chips. I tend to make like breadfruit chips or sweet potato chips or plantain chips. You can make those as well too, if you want to have something local, or you can go and purchase packaged chips. But it's always nice to have some nice type of local chips as well. And of course, I did mention the stoves. You can always buy pasta, dry stuff like that, pasta and rice, which you can also use to cook with. And but I would highly advise getting a small little stove that you can always cook in, so that things are still normal if you're at home, and you don't have to be inconvenienced of not having a stove or anything to cook on. So those are just a few suggestions that I could mention.
So we're going to have all this wonderful food in our go bags. And what else are we going to have in our go bags, Richard?
What we would want to have ideally is a mix of things. You want to have, like we touched on before, you want to have some clean clothing. You want to have some of the items that John referred to. One of my things that I find that works really well in that scenario is actually yam, because it stays well, and you can prepare it in different ways. You can do it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as far as I'm concerned. Likewise, breadfruit. But you want to have medications for those persons in your household who may be on specific medications. So you want to have those in adequate quantities. You want to have stuff like a can opener, because you may not have electricity. So you want to have a mechanical can opener. You want to have even a bottle opener, so to speak. You want to have a scissors, perhaps some people would refer to it as baling twine or cooking twine. You can secure things together. You want to have proper shoes, not necessarily slippers, but obviously after the passage of a hurricane, you're uncertain of what your surroundings are. And if you're walking in water, you cannot see what perils or dangers lie in that water. So some good sturdy shoes, perhaps even what we call garden boots, may be a good option there as well too. Flashlights, you want to have stuff like that. And one thing that I always say that you should always have in a go bag is salt, because salt has several uses. You can use it in cooking, you can use it in sterilizing, and you can use it sort of like an antiseptic. Not negating the fact that you should also have a small first aid kit within that go bag scenario. But you're looking at your go bag in this situation, especially when you're looking at children. You want to have the go bag in such a way that the children can manage it. So one of the things that I do with my kids is, for their scenario, they, instead of having a backpack or anything, they have like what the kids call a roller bag. That they man themselves, and that they determine what items go into it. And for young children, perhaps one of the saving graces is perhaps their favorite toy. That toy that makes them feel comfortable, that makes them feel like they're at home. That when if you and the kids have your noise and they're on punishment, they hug that toy so that they feel comforted. And in a strange environment, something like that can go a long way. So touching base again. Your medical supplies, your food, your utility items, your flashlights, your batteries. A good thing to have as well too would be a radio. And nowadays there's so many battery packs that you can charge your cell phones and so on with. Stuff like that really, really comes in handy in your grab and go bag. But you don't want it too big and too cumbersome. And then what my family does, we have a separate bin, a plastic bin that we put the food stuff in. So the adults are more responsible for those, but then everybody has their individual go bag that has the clothes and different stuff in it.
And as I'm imposing on everyone with their area of expertise, CC, as a radio announcer, you become part of the essential services when a hurricane happens. Can you tell me about, how you guys operate, what you advise your listeners to do, and how you go about managing your own families and lives when when you're on the front line, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple of experiences where we've had some fairly serious storms here in Barbados where I've had to be on air, and have to been in a situation where you're checking with your family and it's difficult not to be there. So it's difficult not to be there, and it's a panel like this where I'm getting so much information, so much great information. I mean, Richard is like the czar now. I'm going to call Richard after this, but I agree with him in terms of especially little ones taking that toy. Battery packs. One of the things I suggest to listeners is yes, we all hear about having our documents in those waterproof containers, but Richard and I actually had this conversation earlier where we scan them as well. So you have an electronic copy of your important documents and passports and ID cards. What we do, we're in touch with all the main important outlets, GIS, all those credible news sources, and we are able then to kind of give that information. Radio is immediate, so we hear from a lot of our listeners where we get information and we can then disseminate that information, whether it is a cry for help sometimes, where they're able to, for whatever reason, reach the station better, whether it's, information in terms of down trees or impassable roads. So we recognize in media that we are, in times of crisis, we are supposed to be that calming voice, which is always very important as well to maintain a level of order, of calm, of saying that, of information as well. So that's kind of how we plan, and just being prepared and having a plan for my son when I'm not there and having that plan in place as well. And I'm going to go pack my go bag and call Richard and send him a picture after, be like, is this good? Make sure that we're all good. That's really important information, and having that plan and making sure that everyone knows where I am, where they're supposed to be. If that plan changes, in communication that way as well. So it's important to kind of have that information and be there, but it's also kind of part of you wants to be with your family as well and making sure that they're good too. So
what you raised in terms of communications is an important thing there as well, because while the telecommunications might be the first to come back up, it might be in 2 or 3 days. Now, if you have aging parents or people who you're responsible for or care about, you might want to have a previous plan as to, if there's an emergency, where will you meet? Because you might not be able to call to say, meet me at this place, or how will the message be passed on? Will you call this person who is closer by, or do you have a friend in emergency services who's likely to be assigned to your area who can pass a message? I don't know what the answers are. I don't know if you know, Elizabeth, but the point is you can't rely on the fact that your phone will be up to call afterwards to say, how are you? What's going on? Do you need anything?
Yes, very important point, because even as an emergency worker, which of course I fall into that category, your primary, any person's primary consideration is your family. And the family plan, this is why the family plan is so important, because the family plan should not be limited to your household.
Right.
It is really about the family. And in the Caribbean, we view family
much broader.
In a bit more broadly, yes.
Yes.
So particularly if you have elderly parents who may, say, reside in their own home, one of the considerations you can look at, should the family come together?
But we know that those parents sometimes, they want to do their own thing and remain independent.
This is true. And this is where your backup plan now comes into play.
Right.
So the family plan would indicate, in the aftermath of an event, if we cannot get in contact with one another, a rendezvous point. Yes, that's part of what we recommend for the family plan.
Okay.
One of the things that I would add to that, one of the tricks that I've come across over time, is something as simple as lipstick. So if you have to leave your house at the last minute, what people have been saying is that you can put a note on a mirror using lipstick that won't wash away if your roof is compromised and so on, letting people know where you have gone to. And like you said, sharing your plan ahead of time with neighbors and family members who don't reside in the same geographic location can go a long way as well too. Because imagine first responders coming upon a house that is demolished, and your relatives are seeing this house and recognizing that house and thinking that you're trapped in the house. But using the lipstick on the mirror can give you a
the
hint
window
to where you're going to, or even on the external window, correct?
We're going to assume that the window and the mirrors are going to be still there.
Well, I mean, it's better than nothing, I would suppose. And as Richard said, if the window is intact, then it does mean it's a very good waterproof type of application that can send a message. So any final questions for our panel of experts before we wrap up? And these questions, this is specifically being posed to Cece and John. Do you have any final questions?
I have a question. In terms of, we touched on it earlier in terms of, we're all talking about our go bags, we're all talking about food essentials. And I know that earlier you mentioned, obviously in COVID, mentioned having your mask and your gloves. Are there any other things that you can quickly let us know in terms of these times if we do have to go to a shelter that should be in our go bags in terms of, COVID-19 as well?
No, I think once you follow the instructions from the National Emergency Management agencies, yes, the hand sanitizers, absolutely. But also to bear in mind that there are going to be very specific protocols in place now for the shelters in terms of when you're entering, what you have to do. They're looking at matters of how frequently they're going to disinfect and clean common spaces in the shelters, and including bathrooms and places where we have communal eating. So there are different protocols for that as well. So I think that's about the mental preparation for that and being able to adhere to what's required there. Also that the shelter managers have now all been retrained pretty much throughout the region or are in the process of being retrained. So it's going to be important to listen to what the shelter managers are saying as well. And it's going to be an adjustment. And I think this is the message we want to get across. And persons need to be flexible and also, very importantly, to comply.
Yes. Is there any central... I'm sorry, go ahead, Cece.
I just wanted a quick follow-up. In terms of the average layperson, where can we find those guidelines? I know you've mentioned them several times in terms of online, or is there somewhere that we can go and download these guidelines so that we can prepare ourselves?
It was the same question. So a central repository where we can find that information.
Sure. So the National Emergency Management offices, all of them have websites. And I've been scouring a few over the past few weeks, and most of them already have the shelter guidelines up on their website. So it's important to go and make a check. I'm also noting that there are frequent radio announcements as well coming through in several of the territories. So as a media practitioner, as you would advise as well,
we have them on air as well.
as you would advise as well, you need to listen to the advisories and to check the websites and social media, because there are a lot of postings on the social media pages and through the handles of the emergency services as well.
Now we're going to throw to one last video, and that video is going to be about bonus tips. So tips to keep you safe, to keep your home safe, and we'll take a look at this point.
Trees are one of the biggest causes of home damage when extreme weather occurs. Their size, their weight, and their vulnerability to the wind-water combo make them dangerous and even deadly during hurricane season. Use storm shutters to prevent windows from breaking. If you don't have storm shutters, boarding up your windows will work just as well. Doors leading to the outside should be locked, preferably with several locking mechanisms or a good deadbolt lock. The quickest way to see if your roof has any weak points is to inspect for internal damage. Check your attic or upper floors for spots, stains, mold, and peeling paint. Damp ceilings and walls are a sure sign that water has an access point into your home. Make sure ceiling and walls are fortified with thicker sheathing, plywood or oriented strand board. Have a ceiling structurally independent from the second story of the house built so that if the second story blows away, the safe room on the ground floor remains intact.
Some final tips. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this discussion today. I want to give special thanks to Elizabeth Riley from CEDEMA, who's been a font of information. Elizabeth, do you want to say any final words, anything that you really want to say to our audience across Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean?
I do. I would say that personal preparedness is important. I would say also to ensure that you listen to the guidance and follow the guidance from the National Emergency Management Offices. I know often we have armchair meteorologists in the Caribbean, and I want to emphasize that the information that is relevant to your particular island is best sourced from your local media, from your local meteorological offices and your local media. So I want to emphasize that point and to encourage you all to stay safe during the hurricane season. At all costs, we want to avoid loss of life. Property can be replaced, but lives cannot. So individual preparedness is really key. Thanks.
Mark, any final words?
Just ensure that your insurance is in place and that your values are up to date, and that if you are a renter, that you have your contents insurance cover, and to make sure you stay safe.
I think the key takeaway from the insurance standpoint, as Mark indicated, is to emphasize get an up-to-date evaluation of your home, absolutely. And for me, the whole idea of the replacement cost, that's something that I have to give some thought to. Any final words from any of our panelists online? Keith?
I wanted to just add to what Mark was saying pertaining to your insurance policies, to also do a check on your property, just to ensure that you take all the necessary steps to just reinforce, resecure your property. Ensure that you have your shutters in place if you do have shutters, or that you have provisions to protect your windows, that your roof guttering is cleared from debris, that you prune any trees that are around the property that could cause damage, that you just have a final check on your roofing just to ensure that it is secured and that it works when you need it to work. So just some guidance along the lines of just ensuring that your property is ready to go through a storm.
John?
Yeah, I just would like to say to people as you go to the supermarket, just go ahead and make a list of all the different hurricane foods you want to start collecting in terms of canned goods and cookies and dry goods. And as you go to the supermarket each week or every other 2 weeks, just start to slowly purchase these items so you can start stockpiling to prepare yourself for the hurricane.
Cece?
I just want to say thank you all for your information. But for me, it would be to keep on listening. As Elizabeth has mentioned, you have the advisories, you have the warnings. I think one of the key things we mentioned too was a plan, preparing and having a plan. And just not for, the immediate household, but those around, those who are, in the family, extended family, and even maybe those who are overseas. Because I remember when we were preparing, we have family overseas who kept checking in, and they want to know that we're safe as well. So I think just having that plan and being prepared, and as John mentioned, even if it's slowly, not everyone's going to go out and buy everything all at once, but, you start making your steps so that if and when we are better equipped to kind of deal with that and respond.
Richard, last but the czar certainly couldn't be least.
I'd like to keep it simple and say prior preparation and planning prevents poor performance.
Say that again, Richard.
Prior preparation and planning prevents poor performance.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thanks again.
That sounds like 6 P's.
The 6 P's, yes.
That sounds like 6 P's.
Absolutely. And so we don't end up with 6 P's. What we're going to be posting on our website are lists and plans that you can download and save. You can keep it in your hurricane preparedness bag, and you can go through our checklist. It's Sagicor Hurricane Preparedness Checklist, so that will be available online. And in addition, we will also have contents for your go bag suggestions. Again, there's a PDF that you will be able to download, and it will have special considerations for the elderly, for those who are on special medication, for those who have small children, especially those who are still in diapers or having formula, etc., and what you can do and how you can go about it to make sure that they're as safe as possible. And so goodbye from Sagicor for now, and please be prepared, please be safe, and if you are in a position to volunteer, please volunteer. We need as much help as we can get to prepare for this hurricane season. Thank you.